Hi, my name is SueYeon Chung, and I'm an assistant professor at NYU and Flatiron Institute. I just started my lab in September. It's very special to give a talk in this audience because I did my PhD with Haim, and I spent a lot of time visiting Uri University as a visiting student, probably a good half of my PhD. Sorry I couldn't make it in person because I got this flu from the NeurIPS conference last week. I'm looking forward to visiting in the next opportunity. So I'll be talking about object manifolds in biological and artificial neural networks, from vision to auditory or speech systems. Yeah, I understand I'm in the symbolic brain session, so I'm really excited about this new work that the work that we have been doing. So one of the fundamental questions in neuroscience is to give a description and understanding across multiple levels of abstraction, where we have task functions in the highest level and individual neuron cells firing and single neurons potentiating to strengthen the synaptic connections. And the central question in understanding the brain is to describe how a collection of neurons or synapses collectively implement this behavior or perceptual level tasks. And importantly, the structure of these collections of neural activities will manifest themselves as neural representations. So representations are crucial and crucial intermediate domain between task level description and single neuron properties. And studying the properties and transformations and emergence of these neural representations is the focus of my work that I'll be talking about today. And more specifically, to do this, we're focused on the following three approaches. First is the theory of neural population structures, or theory of neural manifolds. Here, we have developed a theory of task-efficient neural population geometry to answer how we can interpret high-dimensional neural activity and connect it to the implementation of a behavior. Second, using geometrical insights that we got from the theory to understand the structure in neuronal networks, going from deep networks to neural data. And third is developing biologically plausible learning rules that can work effectively on a network level on a complex task as well. But I'll be talking about two of these three ideas today. And let me jump right into the first theme, which is the theory of neural manifolds. Let me start with an example. So let's say we're given a stimulus of a dog, a picture of a dog, then a population of neurons will respond, which can then be represented as a point in the neural state space of n dimensions. So you're seeing this in 3D for visualization, but in general, this will be in n dimensions where n is the number of neurons. So that was about static object, but we know that in real life, these objects can move around and rotate and so on. So now imagine with some kind of stimulus variability, like a rotation of an image, then you'll get different neural responses at different angle, and you'll get this geometrical representations or manifolds in neural state space. So these neural manifolds are a direct consequence of structures in single neurons. So neurons can have tuning curve properties, which we typically think of as a basis for neural coding, and manifolds from these populations of sharply tuned neurons will look different from the ones from weakly tuned neurons. And the hypothesis that I'll be presenting today is that if we can decipher the geometry and the computational role of these neural manifolds, then we can learn something about how cognitive or perceptual tasks are implemented in general. And indeed, there has been a lot of exciting work in our field on the structure of task representations in neural populations, both in neural circuits and also network models. And these observations are coming from not only the sensory systems, but also from motor and higher cognitive areas like prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. So there's a lot of exciting work in this topic. So a lot of us are excited about the prospect of using neural manifolds to understand cognition. Now, the specific approach that I think is very promising is the following. First is building geometrical measures to characterize these task encoding neural populations and manifolds. And second, connecting these geometrical measures with task efficiency of representations. And to answer these questions, let's think about invariant object recognition as a task, which refers to the brain's ability to distinguish between objects across the stimulus variabilities. So for example, we can tell that these pictures on the top, they are the pictures of a car, despite the fact that there's a lot of variabilities in the size and orientation, position, and like backgrounds. And it is one of the tasks that the brain is constantly solving, even right now as you're listening to this talk. So first, we want to represent this problem of invariant object recognition in this neural state space as manifolds. So let's go back to our dog manifold and remember how we went from a stimulus to a point representation in the neural state space to manifolds in the neural population space. And what happens if we had another object class with invariances? And in this case, a set of neurons will respond to two different objects, a dog and a cat, and they'll initially become 2 points in the neural state space. But with the stimulus variabilities, they will move around and become two object manifolds, a dog manifold and a cat manifold. And now you can represent the task of discriminating dogs and cats as a problem of separating these object manifolds. And in the geometrical terms, it means that if we can draw a hyperplane or plane between these object manifolds, that means we can separate them. And we can start to ask questions like, how crowded can we make these manifolds before they are no longer separable? And what is the role of the dimensions or size of the manifolds in how these can be packed up? And you can also ask, can we actually quantify and formalize the linear separability of object neural manifolds and connect it to their geometry? So it turns out there is already a well-developed theory of linear classification called, many of you are familiar, the theory of perceptrons, which comes from both theoretical physics and computer science. And here, the capacity of a perceptron refers to the maximum number of points per neuron or per dimension that can be linearly classified when you're given a random assignment of binary labels to all of these points. And this is an average, a statistical property. So like you're asking the question of, on average, when is the point where you start to not have a classifying solution? And that's the definition of capacity. This is a classical theory, but unfortunately, this is about discrete points, which is just a single realization of a stimulus or single instance of a memory. And in other words, this theory is irrelevant as soon as we have a continuously changing variability, because that will make infinitely many points on a trajectory. And this is a type of change in the stimulus we need to overcome all the time in real life. So we need a theory for classifying manifolds for real-life problems of invariant object recognition. And this is exactly what we developed with Haim and Dan Lee, which is the theory of object manifold capacity. And this tells you about the maximum number of object manifolds you can discriminate per neuron, taking into account the invariances that you have to overcome. Now, this theory is exciting because it's both multi-level and analytic, and I'll explain both of these aspects as we go on. Now, it's worth talking about what capacity here really means. There are several interpretations of the object manifold capacity. So first, it's about how easy or hard it is to discriminate between real-life objects with invariances. Second, it also tells you about how many categories can you read out and remember. And third, it's also about per neuron information content about object classes. So it's a density-like property. And it's about how efficient the neurons are in representing object classes with invariances in a given neural population. And we use the statistical physics approach called replica theory, which allows us to calculate this manifold capacity explicitly. And I won't explain this equation term by term, but instead looking at the simplified form of this equation, we see that the capacity can be expressed in terms of each object manifold's geometrical properties, that is, their dimensionalities and radii. And let's take a full view of what this theory gives us. The key results of the object manifold capacity theory is that there are only certain properties that matter at the intermediate level. So first, the manifold capacity is a task level measure. So it's a higher level measure that is more related to perception, that tells you how separable these categories are, and more importantly, how categories you can invariantly discriminate. And this will be affected by the geometrical properties of neural activities, which is now then is characterized with each category manifold's dimensionality and radius. Now, dimensionality is a huge topic in neuroscience, and there are many different definitions for it. But here, it's the dimensionality of each category manifold relevant for linear classification. And same for radius. There are many ways to measure the size of some data cloud, but here, this is a measure for the size of a manifold relevant for linear classification. And it also turns out, in reality, you also need to take into account the correlations in the data, and most importantly, the correlations between the centers. Now, you can think of these correlations as similarity between classes. So, for example, a cat and a lion classes are more correlated in their locations and than a cat versus a car. So to a first order approximation, including the correlations between the centroids of these object manifolds makes a theoretical method work. Now, how are these measures related, and what does the theory say? The two scenarios that we care about are when the object manifolds are highly tangled or nicely untangled in the neural population space. When it's highly tangled, then the theory says that the capacity will be low, and that's usually driven by the high dimensionality or large sizes of these manifolds, or the high correlations between the locations of these manifolds. And it's simply too hard to pack big and high dimensional and correlated manifolds into the neural state space. And you might see these kind of representations in early regions of sensory processing or before learning a task. And you'll see some of these examples in the next section. On the other hand, if the object manifolds are well separated and untangled, then you'll be able to classify many of these categories, and that will show as high manifold capacity. And in order to have high capacity, you will need to decrease the object manifold's dimensionality, radius, and make them uncorrelated in their locations. And also note that these geometrical properties, they don't always move together. You can have a tiny, high-dimensional noise-like neural manifolds, or low-dimensional, flat and long manifolds. But this theory will capture how these different geometrical properties like dimension and radius and correlations combine together to determine the capacity. So these are what we have published so far. And I think it's also possible to take into account more like correction terms that we have, which is an ongoing work. So to summarize, this theory of neural object manifolds can be used as a multi-level probe for neural population. So now if you give me the data with category memberships for data clouds, and which don't have to be smooth, meaning that it'll work with experimental data as well, then this method will compute the geometrical properties and predict the manifold capacity, which has interesting implications for both neuroscience and machine learning. So first of all, these neural manifolds can provide a mechanistic underpinning for task implementations and generate the population level hypotheses and scenarios, because even under the same task capacity or behavioral performance, you can actually have different combinations of geometrical properties, and those kind of things could be captured by this method. Second, this neural manifold geometry is a consequence of collective properties of neurons, like the structure of tuning curves or distributions. So by connecting the geometry with performance, we're one step closer to understanding the role of individual neurons in task implementation. Now, this was about a theory of capturing the structure in high-dimensional neural data. But now, how do we put this to use? So that's going to be the focus on the second half of the talk, which is about understanding distributed representations in both biological and artificial neural networks using these geometrical insights. Now, there are many recent reports showing the representational correspondence between artificial neural networks and real neural circuits. For example, the work by Yamins and DiCarlo have shown that task-trained deep networks can predict neural activity pretty well in macaque ventral stream. And it has also been shown that their neural population structure and similarity structure are also quite similar between the brain and artificial networks. Now, this makes them a very promising in silico model system of neural circuits. But the challenge now is, while these deep network models may be similar to the brain, the understanding how and why these representations and task performances emerge in an interpretable way is still a challenge. However, I think we should really still take advantage of this opportunity of having full access to everything in the network to get a mechanistic understanding of how behavior or task functions arise from the model's building blocks. And to do this, we use this neural manifold framework as an intermediate level descriptor connecting representations and a task performance. And to this end, we have applied several geometrical techniques to study various problems, going from vision to addition, speech, to language in neural network models that are known to predict neural data, and also experimental data like macaque ventral stream, like the data from DiCarlo lab. And I'll highlight recent studies in vision and speech. So let me start with the work on understanding the pre-trained visual deep neural networks. This is a work with Haim here. The goal here is to use manifolds to understand how deep networks process information layer by layer as a testbed for neural circuits. AlexNet is one of the standard deep networks to study vision, which are also shown to predict primate visual cortex neural data pretty well. So let's use that. And also use ImageNet data. Again, this is a very common benchmark data set for vision. And with ImageNet, let's simply define object manifolds as pictures that belong to the same object class, meaning dog photos from a class of a dog will form a dog manifold as a point cloud, and so on. And also make another version of the manifold by taking a single image and moving this image around, changing the angle, and so on. And then that will form a smooth data augmentation manifold. Now we run these images on AlexNet and we'll extract features similar to what we'll do in neural data and recover object manifolds from AlexNet. And we're then ready to apply this neural manifold capacity theory. And we're going to now ask how the separability occurs across layers. Now, as advertised in the previous section, this manifold capacity theory predicts the empirical manifold capacity pretty well. So the theory works, which is a good sanity check. And then we can follow the manifold capacity and these geometrical parameters across each layer, which we see that they move as predicted, meaning that the manifold capacity increases due to the reduction in the dimensionality and radius and correlations. So the thing that's exciting here is that we can not only tell that the separability or the packability of these manifolds are improving across the layers, but we can say that the reason why they improve is because of the changes in the specific geometrical measures, because we know that these properties are analytically connected. Now, with the full access to the information content and geometrical summaries that we have in each layer, we wondered, can we actually understand what each layer of this network does? And can we check these properties before and after certain network components or a specific layer? To do this, we focus on common circuit motifs of the network. For example, a ReLU layer, which is short for rectified linear unit, which is inspired by neurons' activation function for firing, and show how the said geometrical properties of object manifolds change before and after this layer. And here I'm showing the change in the dimensionality and the correlations. And remember, for increasing the manifold capacity to make them more separable and packable, we want to decrease the manifold dimension and correlation. So you want to be in this green negative bottom left quadrant. But you can see that this ReLU activation decorrelates, which is good. But object manifolds, they also end up becoming higher dimensional, which means that you're on the positive y-axis. So ReLU seems to be doing something good for decorrelating the locations of these manifolds, but it comes at the cost of increasing object manifold dimension. And you can do this for other types of layers and other geometrical properties like radius as well. And I'll summarize this result in a table in the next slide. So this is what I just showed you. The dimensionality goes up and the correlations go down after the activation nonlinearity. And you can do the same thing with radius, which shows that an activation nonlinearity layer, it reduces two properties like radius and correlations, but it comes at the cost of increasing the dimensionality of the manifolds. And you can do this for other neural nonlinearities too. So for example, max pooling units, they pool the incoming firing rates and transmits the max. It's overruled by the maximum firing rate, and it reduces both dimension and radius of the manifolds. But it ends up increasing the correlations between the locations of these manifolds. So it turns out with just a single layer, there's a trade-off between these geometrical properties. But interestingly, there are common circuit motifs that are popular. It's something that people found empirically that it works well. For example, the combination of a convolution layer followed by the ReLU and pooling. And these are inspired by simple cells and activation nonlinearity and pooling nonlinearity. And if you look at what they do to the geometry together, these motifs change the object manifolds favorably in all parameters. And this is, in my perspective, one of the unique and powerful applications of this neural manifold capacity framework to understand what each layer does. And furthermore, we can characterize neural data across the ventral stream hierarchy in macaque visual cortex, which also then presents us a set of fascinating results. This is data coming from Jim DeCarlo lab. And as these measures are general, we're also starting to apply them in neural activities in higher cognitive areas like parietal cortex. In this case, this is in Mongolian gerbils. And they're showing interesting untangling properties in the real data. So to summarize what we have so far, this geometrical way of thinking uncovers mechanisms underlying favorable circuit motif combinations and the limitations of a single layer of homogeneous units, which have implications for the role of different cell types, for example, or underlying which layer has a better capacity with what kind of geometrical properties. Those kind of things can be identified. And more generally, this shows the power of neural manifold capacity as an intermediate level descriptor because task implementation, between the task implementation and the representational structure. And I know I'm biased, but I do think that we're just starting to scratch the surface of what's possible here. So after identifying the geometrical role of these circuit motifs, then we started thinking we can probably impose additional neural constraints on the deep network models and understand the role of those constraints from the neuroscience perspective. And to this end, we studied the role of neuronal noise, like a stochastic noise, in a phenomenon called adversarial robustness. And let me explain what that is. And then this was a collaboration with labs of Jim DiCarlo and Josh McDermott. So let's say for a standard image, like this picture of a panda here, both humans and artificial neural networks can recognize this as a panda. But if you add a small perturbation to this image and feed it through the artificial neural network, then you'll find that while this looks like a panda to us, the network is very confident that it's a gibbon. So this is an interesting testbed because this is a case where we see the divergence between artificial neural networks and humans, where humans are performing much better than artificial neural networks. And it turns out if you make this network more like the real visual cortex by adding a front end based on classical linear nonlinear Poisson model, and it makes the network suddenly more robust to adversarial perturbations without expensive adversarial training, like adding all of these perturbations as part of the training set, which actually makes the data set like dozens of times bigger. And this is a result shown by Jim DiCarlo and coworkers, but it wasn't clear why or how this happens. And in addition, prior reports on the role of stochasticity were conflicting, including early work in the field reporting that random perturbations don't necessarily help with adversarial robustness. So what's going on here? You can see that it does better, but like we have no idea why adding stochasticity or V1 filters help with adversarial robustness. So this is where it would be great if we can go in and geometrically understand how adversarial perturbations are affected by these neuronal constraints, such as neural stochasticity, which we can in fact define these adversarial perturbations as noise-like manifolds. And also we can define, adversarial perturbation manifold. And we can also define stochastic noise as clouds around a single exemplar. And with this, we identified two interesting geometrical effects that compete with each other. First is a positive effect. So when you add a noise, then noise a cloud around a clean image and a noise cloud around an adversarial perturbations, they start to overlap. And this overlap drives an adversarial robustness because it's as if making the training and the test set distribution similar to each other. But clearly, having too much noise must be bad for class separability because it'll make the class manifolds become bigger and more diffuse. So there's a negative effect, which you can see geometrically again with this manifold theory. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. And with these competing effects of geometry, they result in a non-monotonic relationship and a peak in adversarial performance as a function of the level of noise. And the optimal level of noise for performance should be predictable from quantifying these two geometrical effects. And indeed, we find a high correlation between the predicted and observed optimal level of noise in the last layer. Now, these two effects seem intuitive in hindsight, but finding a quantitative balance between these two forces is hard to do without precise geometrical measures. And furthermore, these geometrical insights are general, so we should be able to see this phenomenon in other modalities as well. And audition and speech is the modality where we were able to show the similar geometrical phenomenon to visual systems in the past. So that's a good place to look. And we worked with Josh McDermott lab, that does some auditory work, to inject a similar kind of neural stochastic noise to an auditory deep network model, which is previously shown to predict human auditory cortex data. And it turns out it renders similar adversarial robustness without explicit training, where we find a very similar underlying geometry. And since we have a little bit of a time, I also wanted to show you another example of using this manifold measure on understanding how the speech recognition is done for this session. So deep speech model is one of the state-of-the-art speech recognition model, where if you have a spoken speech, like 1,000 hours of English speech that's been read, and this data set is called Libris speech, and that sound is turned into a sequence of spectrograms, and that's fed into this deep and recurrent model, and they are processed as a sequence of sound images, so to speak, and they run through the layers. And it pops out the character in output, where every time step is a character, and you turn this into a readable text after integrating with the recurrent layer in the final layer. So this is how the network is trained, and we can also look at what's happening in the internal representations of this otherwise quite black box model. Now, what you can do is to take the responses in this network with the labels that correspond to the same word that are spoken by different speakers, and also the same words that occur in different parts of a sentence, and define the word manifold in this deep recurrent network model of a speech. And you can see that in an internal representation of this deep speech model, the capacity for defined for each word, they also improve across layers. And you can also see the similar kind of trend in a convolution version of a speech model as well. But what you see is that initially, before training a network, the capacity is flat. But as a result of training, you can see that the manifold capacity for words emerge, which means that they have untangled due to the result of training. Now, what happens to the geometry? You can see that the improvement in the capacity is also, again, as a result of the reduction in the manifold, in dimensionality, and correlations about the words that are being untangled as a result of recognizing a speech. Now, these deep recurrent network models are not explicitly trained on words. So then how about other speech or auditory objects that you can look at? So you could actually define other types of speech or language manifolds on multiple scales. For example, you can chop the sequence of sounds into phonemes, which is a smaller range than the word. Or you could also tag some of these the word manifolds with the part of speech, which have more to do with the grammatical structure of a sentence than just a word. So, for example, part of speech manifolds will correspond to noun, verb, or pronoun, while words are like, as we know, phonemes are like smaller chunks of the sound. And then now the question is, how does that get untangled in internal representations? And we see that the manifold capacity for all of these different speech objects at different scales, they all emerge as a result of training, and with the following manifold geometry. You can also go in even deeper and then zoom in further to see a smaller scale untangling at each dynamical time step. So far we looked at the whole response across all time steps that correspond to a word or phoneme as a big image of an auditory or language manifold. But we can also look at each time step where you get rid of the time dimension and you just look at the response at each time, and treat each time step as a representation, and then look at the trajectory of how these manifolds at each time step untangle, and then ask if if it looks something like this. And the hypothesis here is that whether different words get untangled across different time steps as a result of recurrent dynamical time steps. And it turns out, yes, the result is that's true. The capacity across recurrent time steps show that untangling is maximal at the midpoint of a word. And this effect is actually larger in later recurrent layers. So as you're speaking a word, there's a little bit of a separation over dynamical time step, and it comes back to prepare for the next word. And the separation is at its maximum in the later part of speech recognition. And you can also see this in real data. So it's the picture of the very last representations corresponding to the same word, but in different contexts, spoken by different people. And then you can see that over dynamical time steps, they're initially tangled, but they separate and it comes back. And this is probably, this is how deep speech network recognizes different word. And it'll be very curious if it's actually the case in the real brain as well. So this metric is pretty versatile, and you can use it across different modalities in the artificial or real neural data. You can look at across different layers or different brain regions, or you can probe learning epochs or task acquisition in the real brain. Or recurrent time steps to characterize the dynamics, but all from the task-efficient geometry perspective. So let me summarize the results that we saw so far here. So first, we showed a layer-by-layer understanding of how networks process information through geometry to support their tasks. And second, we saw that the geometry helped us understand the role of neuronal noise on human-like traits such as adversarial robustness. We saw that it was also general across vision and audition. And in both of these problems, I wanted to highlight a few things. First, there were competing effects between the geometrical properties like the dimension, radius, and correlations. And this is hard to probe unless there are good measures. We can always visualize the data, but to check exactly what is the role of each layer or each circuit motif, or the role of each parameter, we need a good quantifiable measures of the underlying neural manifolds that are relevant for the task. And this was the focus of our theory. And second, these geometrical interpretations are general across modalities, as you can see from going from vision to speech. And I didn't show the NLP models, but you could also do that on like natural language processing problems too. And it helps discover unifying and common phenomena across different modalities, or different regions of the brain, or across different spatial or temporal scales. And this is why I think neural manifolds as a population level descriptor is such a powerful framework to connect different scales. And I think it'll eventually help us get closer to understand the neuronal basis of behavior and cognition. And I think in the future, we could probably use it as a design principle and build a more informed design of brain network models or deep learning models, or connected to the role of single neuron structures, or connected to the how different learning rules or statistics of different stimuli will shape and form these manifold structures. So here's some of the published and ongoing work which I talked about during this talk. And just to summarize, the task-efficient representation geometry approach is extremely useful because this approach provides a theory that connects the population structure with embedded task information. And this geometric theory allows for the characterization of neural data directly, and neural data can also provide inspirations for additional neural manifold theory. Now, when you have neural network models that are inspired by neuroscience, then you can also open the black box of these networks with population level analysis techniques like this neural manifold theory. And with that, I hope I was able to convince you that by focusing on representations, population level representations, particularly on their task efficiency and geometry and how they transform with machine learning models, this combined approach is an exciting and a promising direction for understanding the computation in the brain. And with that, I thank my mentors and collaborators and funding sources, and especially my advisor, Haim, and my collaborators from Hebrew University. And thank you for your attention. And we're also hiring at NYU and Flatiron if you're interested in this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you, SueYeon. We have maybe time for one or two questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I would have two questions. One question would be, you talked about your approach in the context of invariant object recognition. What about the properties that invariant object recognition gets rid of, like the location of an object? Can you also extend your approach, both in theory and in practice, to, for example, finding the location of an object, which would then not be a category, but more continuous variable? That's the first question.
Can you, it seems like the sound is a little bit blurry. Is there a way to make it slightly sharper, or can someone repeat it closer? Sorry about that.
Does that work better?
Yeah, this is way better. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Right. Oh yeah. Right. So I'll start with I'll start with answering the second question. So I think training a deep network or like the neural network model with the measures that I just talked about explicitly it'll be a pretty computationally heavy problem. But we actually have unpublished work with one of my new students here, which is trying to train a network model with like an approximate measures of these capacities and geometries, and I think it is a computational challenge, but I think it's a pretty interesting direction to study, to use these measures as an objective of a study, and you'll hear more about it maybe in a couple of months. And to answer the first question, I think it can be answered in two ways. So when you were asking about other aspects of a visual stimuli, like the position or angle, one way to take that into account is how these kind of nuisance or continuous variables affect the geometry of the manifolds, and if they and one question is like what might be the geometric structure which throws away this information versus keeping this information. And I imagine the types of the geometrical configurations that keep these kind of information will have a different type of it might have more like factorized or aligned version of object manifold configuration compared to the geometric configuration that throw those kind of information away, which might be more like points or extremely compressed manifolds. And I think we can actually take into account the correlations of like how they are, how these manifolds are aligned with each other, for example, so that you could incorporate those kind of things into the next correction term for the manifold capacity theory. The other is explicitly computing the manifold capacity for these continuous measures, which is less straightforward, but I think it's probably doable if there's enough time. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Michal Ben-Shachar from Bar-Ilan University.
Okay. So I gave my talk a very long title. Maybe I should have just called it "And Now for Something Completely Different." So this is going to be a different talk. I'm going to tell you about research that we do in my lab for the last 10, 15 years when we're studying the neurobiology of language with a focus on the white matter pathways. And specifically, we map the pathways in individual participants, and then we look at properties of different groups of participants and compare them, or we correlate the properties of pathways with various measures of language processing, and I'm going to tell you a lot more about this at this point. Many of you probably know that in the past several years, our model of the language pathways changed dramatically from this earlier model by Geschwind and Wernicke and Lichtheim and so on, where we thought we had two main regions for language processing, Wernicke's and Broca's in the left hemisphere, connected by this single pathway, the arcuate fasciculus. These days, we moved on to talk about many more pathways. We divide them into the dorsal pathways and the ventral pathways, and we also think that they're not limited to the left hemisphere, but many of the relevant pathways reside in the right hemisphere as well. So to extend this framework in such a way, we had to realize that linguistic computations like lexical access and sentence comprehension and speech production and so on rely on multiple brain regions. And the information is processed along multiple converging and diverging pathways. So this is not our own novel idea, but rather this general approach of a dual processing scheme came to us from vision research, where, as we all know, it was developed to have two particular pathways, one along the ventral stream that's interested in what is this stimulus, and the other more dorsal pathway, which extracts information about where and how to use this stimulus. And from vision, this idea percolated into auditory neuroscience, where it was argued, and there is a brain here, believe me, but somehow the projector doesn't want to show it. But the idea of dorsal and ventral pathways emerged in auditory neuroscience as well, and from auditory neuroscience it was a short trip to speech processing. So dual stream models of speech processing have evolved in the last 10 years or so, maybe 20 years. And most of these different models suggest a dorsal stream that maps between sensory information and production, and a ventral stream, sometimes bilaterally, but not always, that is involved in recognition. So we're going to talk more about this particular model throughout this talk, and I want to highlight that when we talk about speech processing, the ventral stream, bilaterally distributed, is typically involved in lexical access, in mapping sound to meaning, so in recognizing words and getting to what they mean. Whereas the dorsal stream, that maps between similar regions, more or less, posterior temporal regions and frontal regions, is more involved in extracting the phonological structure of words, dividing words into phonemes that we just heard about, and mapping between sensory and motor information. So this model has better descriptive validity compared to the Geschwind model that we looked at earlier. It's still missing many processes that are not specified here, and specifically, the more decompositional you go, the less it is represented in this model. So for example, dividing words into their morphemes, or dividing sentences into their syntactic components, or prosodic analysis is not really represented in this model. And there are many pathways that are not represented in this model as well, and might be relevant for speech analysis or language processing. So what I want to do in this talk is tell you two stories. One is about the ventral pathways and their involvement in word structure decomposition. And the other, the second story, regards the dorsal pathways, extending them to pathways that are not in this model, including the frontal Aslan tract and the cerebellar pathways, and looking at the roles of these pathways in mediating fluency and sensory motor fluency, not really the other stuff. I'm also going to talk about how we generalize these findings across samples and languages and modalities, and that's going to be a big recurring theme in this talk. Okay, so a very brief, since this is diffusion MRI is not yet as popular as fMRI, I'm going to allow myself a methodological slide or two. But many of you probably know that we acquire diffusion imaging data on the same MRI machine as we use for anatomical and functional images. And in this case, we use a sequence that is sensitized to the speed of water diffusion. And once we did that, and we mapped the speed of water diffusion in many different directions, we can model this information either as a tensor, or later on in this talk, I'll show how we model it using more complicated shapes, extract the eigenvalues of this tensor, and then calculate various shortcuts of how these eigenvalues refer to each other. And those kinds of measures like fractional anisotropy or mean diffusivity estimate how elongated this tensor is. and how large it is, basically. We take this information and separately, we use these tensors in order to track fibers in individual participants' brains. And then we can have the same living individuals go through a bunch of behavioral tests so that eventually we're ready to look at associations between the quantitative estimates of the tensors in their brains and their behavioral properties. So we can do this as a correlation analysis in each of these tracks. We can compare between different groups of individuals. We're going to see some of that soon. We can compare groups of individuals along the pathways. That's something that we like to do. Or even look at the associations along the pathways. And these kinds of analysis give us better sensitivity to these tracks, better than just looking at the mean across the entire track. Please keep in mind that these diffusivity parameters are affected by multiple structural properties of the white matter. So this is not, so anisotropy, for example, is not an estimate of myelin. It's affected by myelin, it's affected by axonal density, it's affected by directional coherence, by thickness, and all of these factors eventually factor in to have some sort of effect on our quantitative measures. And yet, we can still measure them in living individuals, which is better than what we could do 20 years ago. So the first story that I'm going to tell you deals with how we look at words and we extract their internal structure. And this is work done as a PhD student by Maya Jablonski, who's now a postdoc. For those of you who are not very well versed in morphology, and I tried to replace every place in this talk where I use morphology to word structure, because I realized that in neuroscience, morphology usually refers to something completely different. So word structure or morphology deals with how words can be decomposed into different components. So for example, a word like unhelpful can be decomposed into 3 morphemes. And those are the structural building blocks, if you will, of the words. And this is a very powerful compositional tool that allows us to generate new words, for example, like retweeted and so on. And we would like to know where it fits in the reading and language pathways. And of course, if we know where it fits in these pathways, it will help us also know more about the type of process in which we use to decompose words into their morphemes. Okay, so we use where as a tool to map to a type of process. Okay, so the first study I'm going to show you is a study that we did in collaboration with Kathy Russell and Joe Taylor in London, and they collected data from 45 adult English readers, and they collected diffusion MRI as well as behavioral measures in these participants. And specifically, the way that we quantify sensitivity to word structure is by comparing 2 types of stimuli. So individuals are sitting across a computer screen, and they have to decide from many different stimuli if this is a word or not a word. And for all the pseudo words that we present them, the non-words, there is 2 different types of non-words that we present. Some of them are made up of real morphemes, like these guys, and the other ones are made up include an invented morpheme. So the difference between these 2 stimuli captures the internal structure of the stimulus, and it turns out that it matters a lot for you as a participant. It's much easier to reject Towerla as a non-word than it is to reject Towerly as a non-word. And you can see that, first of all, the accuracy drops for this kind of stimulus. And second of all, there's a huge range of performance levels, which is really important if you're going to look for associations. You have to have a range between individuals. So using this kind of a discrepancy between the 2 stimulus types, we can now quantify your sensitivity to word structure. And we take this information, we call it morphemic cost, and we correlate it with anisotropy along the pathways. We analyze the dorsal pathways and the ventral pathways bilaterally for each individual. The results show quite consistently the sensitivity to English word structure correlates with the properties of the ventral tracts bilaterally, and it doesn't correlate with properties of the dorsal tracts. And this is true for several different tracts, but the shared property of all these tracts is that they are ventral and bilateral, as you can see over here. And we can look at different measures of the parameters over here, but I'm not going to get into it. The second chapter, which I think is even more important, actually, where we wanted to get here, was generalizing this effect across languages. So we started from English because the data already existed, but actually we were interested in Hebrew. And Hebrew is a really interesting language to study in this respect because Hebrew is a morphologically rich language, in contrast with English, where many of the words that you use all the time are not decomposable. Hebrew uses morphology all the time. So for example, all the verbs in Hebrew are multimorphemic. They are made up of at least 2 morphemes. That's for verbs, and many of the nouns as well have this principle. So if you're going to analyze word structure, better look at Hebrew, or at least look at Hebrew as well. And then we went to look at Hebrew, and we already knew that it's not so trivial to generalize this finding to Hebrew, because Hebrew is not always lending itself to generalization so nicely. For example, some of the hallmark phenomena in visual word recognition do not generalize to root-derived Hebrew words. This was shown by Adas Vilan and Ram Frost, for example, and many others. Okay, so basically did the same study in Hebrew. Took us a few years. And it took us also some time to develop a similar paradigm to quantify word structure sensitivity in Hebrew, but we did that as well. And we do something very, very similar in Hebrew as we did in English. The pseudo words are either made up of real morphemes, so this is a real root in Hebrew, or they're made up of an invented root embedded in a real pattern. And we see again in Hebrew, as we saw in English, that this has a huge effect on individuals, and they're very variable in how they're affected. Okay, so similar enough, we can look at the associations with the brain. And to make a very long story short, and if you like the long story, read the paper, but to make a long story short, there's a really nice generalization between Hebrew and English, such that in Hebrew as well, bilateral ventral pathways show associations with sensitivity to word structure. Okay? I'm really not getting into the details because it's a long story, and some of the details actually differ. But we're more interested in the generalizations than in the differences in this case. The other generalization I wanted to show you considers stimulus modality and response modality and task. So we had a completely separate experiment that we did with the same individuals in which we asked them to produce words based on a given root. So this was all done in Hebrew, and this was, in this case, done in a spoken modality. You're given a root. Yes, a root is spoken to you, and you have to produce as many, or you're given a word, and you have to produce as many words as possible that come from the same root. So there's no reading involved, there's no visual presentation involved. Everything is auditory and involves word production rather than comprehension or pushing buttons. And what you can see is that, again, bilateral ventral pathways show significant associations with your score in this root fluency task. That also involves decomposing the word into the root and the pattern and generating words in this case. Of course, not everything generalizes. Now that the task involves producing language, we see associations in other dorsal pathways that are involved in language production as well. So the task modulates the effects that we get, but we also see generalizations across task an analysis pipeline that changed completely, by the way. Now we're doing a different type of modeling and a different type of tractography. Okay, so again, if you're interested in a long story, this is already published. To summarize this first story, what we've seen is that word structure associations are found in the bilateral ventral pathways associated with language, and this is true across languages, and it also generalizes across task and modality and processing pipelines. Of course, there are many open questions to ask, specific questions. For example, what if we put these words in context? What if we change the task even further? I want to highlight also what we didn't learn from this study. We did not learn that the ventral pathways are devoted to word structure decomposition. It's very tempting when you look at these associations to think that now we have a one-to-one mapping between a tract and some kind of property cognitive process that's happening in this tract. And these are huge tracts, and they're probably conveying information from many different subregions to a big region somewhere else, and they're probably involved in many functionalities. We already know that they're involved, for example, in lexical access and in semantic processing of words. Let's not make the mistake that we sometimes made in fMRI, not anymore, where we find something in the brain and we think this is the role of that region. This is not the role of this pathway. It's one thing that it's involved in. Where we need to go, in my opinion, is to look more at compositional processes. So there's very little data published on the white matter pathways associated with syntactic analysis, with prosodic processing, with combinatorial semantics. So we know very little about these processes. I also think that we need to move to map more specific processes rather than domains. These are general domains, and we want to be able to say something about the actual process that's happening and not about a general idea of a domain. We need to have more generalizations beyond tasks and so on. And we want to use these brain findings in order to eventually understand the processes themselves better. Second story concerns the extended dorsal stream and its role in adults who stutter and in neurotypicals. And this is a PhD project of Sivan Yossinger, who's here in the audience. And we are going to look at this topic from two complementary approaches. One is to look for differences in tract properties between those who do and do not stutter. And that will give us some clue about how fluency maps into pathways. And the second is to look for associations with fluency with each group, within each of these groups specifically. So again, the first sub-story that I want to tell you here is about a tract that's a bit newer to us. We didn't know anything about the frontal Aslan tract until, or not much, until 2012. And then the first paper came out about this pathway. We started looking at it in the context of stuttering as well. And one of the first papers that were published about this looked at patients with primary progressive aphasia and showed that the specific type of PPA patients that have non-fluent PPA have some sort of deficit to this pathway. So this is one clue that it's involved in fluency. Perhaps also grammatical processing, because these patients also have some agrammatism. Based on this, we took this idea and looked at a group of participants who were adult and were stuttering from childhood. So this is persistent developmental stuttering in adults. We mapped the frontal Aslan tract in each of these individuals, and actually a tract that lends itself nicely to tractography. And then we looked at the properties of the frontal Aslan tract, shorthand FAT, in the left and right hemispheres. We did not find any differences in anisotropy between the two groups of adults who stutter and controls, but we did find differences in mean diffusivity, such that adults who stutter have elevated mean diffusivity in the frontal assent tract. Even more interestingly, if you look at a part of this pathway that shows a difference, and you look at associations with speech rate, it turns out that in the group of adults who stutter, we could also see a preliminary association, preliminary because it's not a very large group, between speech rate, articulation rate, and mean diffusivity of this pathway. And let me reassure you that when we calculate articulation rate in these participants who stutter, we exclude all the segments in which they stuttered. So articulation rate means that you're analyzing syllables per second only on the fluent segments of their speech. Okay. This initial finding was replicated recently in a collaboration that we had with a group from McGill that acquired a completely independent data set on a sample of English-French speakers who do and do not stutter. And again, the frontal assent tract shows a difference in mean diffusivity between these two groups. Sometimes it's shown in the mean diffusivity across the entire tract and sometimes along the tract. And this is a bilateral effect, as we saw in the Hebrew speakers. By the way, in this group, similarly to what we've seen in the Hebrew speakers, there's also a difference in the arcuate fasciculus, which is a well-known dorsal pathway. But I'm not going to get deep into this finding. And just to reassure you that there are no significant differences in the ventral pathways. So this is a dorsal effect that relates to speech processing, speech rate production. And probably the last piece of results that I'm going to drop on you concerns the cerebellar pathways. So to look at the cerebellar pathways, again, in adults who stutter and those who do not, we first developed automated tools to track these cerebellar peduncles, which are large enough for us to quantify using diffusion imaging. And indeed, as you can see over here, Sivan developed this method and then found these pathways. This is just a few examples from those who do and do not stutter. And you can find the peduncles nicely in individual participants. You do a lot of work and you find them in everybody and so on. And then you look at the group differences and you see no group differences. So this is something that we've now seen twice. No group differences along the cerebellar peduncles between individuals who stutter and those who do not. We could have stopped here. Luckily, we didn't, because if you look at associations with, again, articulation rate along the peduncles, you can find that the left ICP, the left inferior cerebellar peduncle, shows a significant association with articulation rate, between articulation rate and FA, in the group of adults who stutter, but not in the controls. And this difference between the two correlations is significant. So we repeated this kind of analysis, but using more advanced tools, and in the other sample, larger sample of neurotypical adults. So in this case, we're modeling diffusivity using more complex shapes, and we're using probabilistic stratigraphy in order to find the cerebellar peduncles. And if you do this, you can actually track the cerebellar peduncles through the decussation as they decussate to the other side of the brain. So advancing the methods here has definitely advanced our abilities. So now you can look at the properties of the cerebellar peduncles along the tract for each of the peduncles, left and right hemispheres, and look at associations with various measures of fluency. When you do that in a sample of 45 adults who do not stutter, you find that there are some associations in this sample between properties of the right superior cerebellar peduncles and phonemic fluency. This is a nice finding because in lesion literature, if you have a lesion in your right cerebellum, you also have a deficit in phonemic fluency and not in semantic fluency. As a side comment, phonemic fluency is when I ask you to produce as many words as possible starting in a given letter. Semantic fluency is if I ask you to produce as many words coming from a certain semantic category. And it looks like phonemic fluency is more relevant to the cerebellar pathways coming from the right cerebellum, or perhaps this is just a harder task to provide. The other correlation we found was with speaking rate, but not with articulation rate in the right MCP. So the right cerebellum in general, the connections of the right cerebellum show these new associations that we didn't see in adults who stutter, but now we see them in individuals who are fluent speakers of Hebrew in this case. And everything stays significant after you control for articulation rate, which is really important because it suggests this is not just a motor effect. So lastly, we looked at the correlation between the inferior cerebellar peduncle and articulation rate, and we did not see any association, similarly to what we've seen earlier in the control participants. So in the inferior cerebellar peduncle, in these two independent samples, there is no association if you are a fluent speaker. So that was a lot of data, I realize. I actually want to highlight something aside the point, not about the data itself, but about a specific thing that we sampled here. We've seen that there are no significant group differences between the cerebellar peduncles of those who do and do not stutter. On the other hand, when we look at associations, we see a significant difference in the association pattern. And that's not the first time that we see something like that. In children who were born prematurely compared to full-term born children, you also see sometimes differences in association patterns, but no differences in the group properties. So when you compare the groups, you sometimes don't see anything, but if you look at association patterns, the association patterns are more selective. And that's been found in other groups as well. So it suggests that sometimes we find differential reliance on a tract for a specific cognitive process, whereas the tract itself doesn't show a significant group pathway, a group difference. A summary point, additional summary point here is that, of course, this is not the end of what we know about the language pathway scheme, and it continues to evolve as we gather new data. I want to go back to the future theme and talk about what we need to know beyond this point. And definitely an important point is to move from associations to manipulations. So when we find associations or group differences between adults who stutter and those who do not, this is after a lifelong of stuttering, and it could have been shaped by their experience. It doesn't mean that this is the reason why these people stutter. And if we want to go to causality, we need to go earlier in life, which is done in several places in the world, and we need to be able to manipulate the behavior or the pathways in some creative way, for example, by intervention studies. And then we can say something about causality rather than just associations. So associations, I think, is a really good starting point, but we need to move towards intervention studies. I already said this, and I'm putting this here again, that it's a great time to move towards studying specific processes in language rather than domains. So phonology is a domain, syntax is a domain, and we know much more about specific processes within each of these domains, and it doesn't make sense to try to map a whole domain into the brain, but rather to look at specific processes, and then interpretation is also much more available. I try to show you that replications and generalizations are really critical here because we want to study processes rather than a specific task or a specific stimulus or a specific language. And actually working on language gives you a really natural way to generalize across different languages that have very different superficial features. And one other thing I wanted to add for the future is, of course, and we're already doing this, but there needs to be much more, is to integrate our findings or this kind of findings with more quantitative MR methods, like the ones that are developed here in Aviv Metzer's lab or in Yaniv Asaf's lab in Tel Aviv, to improve interpretability of our findings. And finally, we want to study the interfaces with other systems, because language is not living in its own world, but rather is part of a whole cognitive system. So it's probably time to start looking at these interfaces better. I want to thank all these people, and particularly my students in Bar-Ilan University, and many of whom are here in the audience, and my collaborator, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Beautiful talk. But I wonder, is there a theoretical or cognitive theoretical framework within which progress in this direction can be embedded? In other words, going beyond mapping. You're mapping more and more high resolution processes versus domains and across languages and so on. But I wonder how this information can be integrated into a theoretical framework of how the brain generates language.
So it's interesting, because I was preparing a response, because while we're listening, we're also predicting what we're going to produce, right? That's how language works. So I was preparing a response that talks about how we embed this kind of work within theory about language. But then your question was actually, how do we embed this work in terms of a theory about the brain? And I think both of them are important. So when we do this kind of work, we derive questions and predictions coming from models that were developed in linguistics and in psycholinguistics and in neuropsychology of language based on lesion studies and so on. And that's where we derive predictions. So when, for example, if we choose to look at derivational morphology, which is the type of word structure manipulation that we had here, this is coming from a really detailed model of different types of morphemes and their different roles in lexical access on the one hand, and in inflection and syntax on the other hand. So all of this, can't fit into the talk and needs too much background, but this is where this kind of work derives its theoretical framework. And I think the part where you derive a mechanistic explanation in neuroscience is at this point a little far. There are some suggestions. Uri's talk is probably going to go very much in that direction. On a completely different perspective, Friedman Pulvermuller has tried to suggest the kinds of mechanistic neuroscience explanations that you might be referring to. At this point, the deepest that we go is what do we currently, in this kind of talk, is what do we currently know about different pathways and how do we map this information into these properties. But eventually you would like to look at these pathways connect different brain territories, not really regions, but territories, big clusters of regions. So you want to relate this kind of data with functional measurements from these regions and start to build a better, a more elaborate map. Eventually it's going to be a map. And if you want to get into a more elaborate resolution of the underlying structures, this is not the level of discussion that we are doing here.
So I have a question. So to what extent is stuttering or speed of articulation correlated with other measures of cognitive abilities, motor abilities? And if they are correlated, how do you dissociate between these brain-related measures? How do you know that they're related to stuttering rather than something completely different?
Interesting. So we looked at a lot of language measures in adults who stutter, and it was really interesting to see that they don't differ on any of these measures: phonological awareness, syntactic processing, lexical access if it's written. They're excellent, as good or slightly better than our control participants. So I'm not concerned about their language abilities being confounded with what we're looking at here. Motorically, however, there are different opinions. There is in the literature a few studies that argue that they found differences in motor learning between those who do and do not stutter. We couldn't replicate it, but maybe we just weren't powered to look at it. So this is possible. It's possible that it's coming from the same. So it's motor learning. It's not motor performance per se, but it's your ability to extract motor regularities over time. That's a possibility. Another sort of general cognitive ability where they do differ is synchronization to an external rhythm. So if you do a simple task of tapping to a metronome, you'll see subtle differences between those who do and do not stutter. And actually, this ability is associated, so we measured associations between this ability and dorsal pathways, and there are dorsal associations in the cerebellum and in the arcuate fasciculus with sensory motor synchronization. So I think it is possible that this is actually a common denominator for both of these processes. And actually it would be really interesting if you can train sensory motor synchronization and see changes, resulting changes in the white matter pathways and in your fluency. But this is, we don't know what the answer is yet.
Are there any more questions? So let's thank Michal again.
Thank you.
And we will take a 20-minute coffee break.
מחברים פה. אין בעיה. אתה תעזור לו? אני צריך USB ל-USB-C, HDMI ל-USB-C. אם אין לך... זה לטעינה, כן? זה לטעינה, כן. כן, כי זה אמריקאי, אם אתה יכול אמריקאי בלי זה, אז לא צריך את זה. אוקיי. ויש לך פוינטר בפנים פה? לא, צריך גם ראש. אני אחבר אותו. אבל צריך לחבר את הפוינטר ל-USB שלו. חכה, אני אשים במצגת. זה עובד. כן, למה זה חרך? מה? תראה איך זה נראה יפה על המסך. אוי, זה ממש לא בפוקוס, מה זה?
לא, זה לא קשור לחיבור.
למה זה קשור?
זה האיכות של שאתה מוציא ממנו את הדאטה.
איך, מה?
כן, ראית כולם עבדו חלק, אבל זה לא יודע. הרזולוציה ממש גבוהה אולי, לא יודע.
הרזולוציה מעולה על המסך. extend.
ננסה עכשיו.
רק לבחור את המסך, סתם. כן, תקריא החוצה.
זה הרבה יותר טוב.
עדיין חרא.
אבל זה המקסימום שתוכל לתת את המקרן. לא אתן לך יותר טוב. אבל בגלל זה הרזולוציה יותר גבוהה.
נכון, בוא נעשה identify. אוקיי. איזה רזולוציה אתה? איזה רזולוציה אתה רוצה? יותר נמוכה?
לא, אם אתה נותן יותר נמוכה יהיה לך יותר גדול.
יותר גרוע, זה לא טוב.
זה המקסימום שתוכל לתת.
זה חרא של מקרן, כי המסך שלי מעולה, אתה רואה? תראה מה זה.
אבל כשאתה עולה למעלה, אתה רואה, לא, זה לא בלרי. בלרי כדי שאתה קרוב מדי. אבל לפני זה היה מלא פיקסלים.
כן.
לא, זה הרבה יותר טוב. זה המקסימום שתוכל לתת.
טוב, יאללה. למה יהיה? אריאל, אודי דמוק. אוקיי.
ממש.
שר עולה. איך היה מייקל?
בסדר, כאילו זה היה כל הפרויקטים של יופוניה, באמת שהם עושים דברים יפים.
זה מכונה זה...
תקשיב, אתה לא מבין, זה 10 פרויקטים, רק ביופוניה, רק כאילו, זה ספיץ, זה מכונה. באמצע ההרצאה, אני יודע, אני לא אומר את זה ככה, אני לא מפיצה.
אתה עושה כמה קולות שיפוט, הוא מוריד רזולוציה. אז אם אתה רוצה לעבוד ברזולוציה, אם אתה רוצה לעבוד ברזולוציה 8,
מה שהארדן למד, הוא למד את האוטפוט של ה-CNN, של השכבת ביניים?
כן, הוא מותר לו להיות כזה, אבל הוא אומר שהוא שכבה.
אוקיי, לא, אין בעיה, בוא תמור,
אבל הוא, וכן, הוא עושה כלי של שכבה.
כאילו השאלה שלי כזאת, האם משהו למד יעצמת לדבר על ראית את האוטפוט של השכבה החמישית, ואז למדת על האוטפוט של ה-CNN?
כן, לפחות במקור, בזמן במקור, בעבודה שלי, עכשיו אנחנו קצת גדולים לימונים, יש שתי אפשרות, אז אני אענה על שאלה למה אתה לוקח כמה דוגמאות, אם אתה עושה ספיצ'ר פיוריטי בכמה נושאים שאתה מראה שיש לך דאטה high resolution, אז נגיד כך, הרשת שיש לה את ה-high resolution יש לה יכולת להגיד הרשת ה-RNN נגיד שהיא לא יודעת כי זה היה מצב אז עכשיו אם אתה נותן לה קצת איזה ניסוי שמטרה אז פשוט נותן לה תהליך ההתכנסות אינפורמציה יש לה, למה יש לה? אינפורמציה שעושה כתקבל תמות ברזולוציה נמוכת היא צריכה עכשיו במקום לעבוד על אין צד של להגיד להם שצפרדע או בננה אני עובדת על איזשהו צד דינמי של לייצר את המשהו שהוא בין דעות של גבוה הוא לא גבוה, הוא כבר יותר מתקדם בגבוה זה לא הכי גבוה זה מה שמעניין עוד אחד ש-2008 אבל
כי ספציפית שאתה מוביל את הקטע של ה-CNN
לא, CNN הוא אינפרנס על anything anymore כשאני לומד, אני אומר יש לי תמונה של שלי אז עכשיו ניקח את דוגמאות אז נגיד של CNN יש רספטים המכונה אני רואה מקביל בין רואה מה שמכיר עכשיו כשיש לי נגיד 4 פיקסלים פה אז אני לוקח את 4 פיקסלים נכון? לא עד שתכון ובאמת שם עכשיו זה הפך לפיקסל עד אני מצד אחד עכשיו אם אני אומר לו אם אני אומר שאתה חובד במיליון שנקרא חיי הלוואי של האם יש פה מטר רצוני יותר ואתה לא לעשות סטארט אז הוא יוכל לחשב את העצמו או הוא יוכל לחשב את הגרדיאנט להגיד טוב כרגע זה לא יכול לעשות אז זה סוג חשן פחות פשוט וכל
Okay, we'd like to start. The last speaker of this session is Uri Hasson from Princeton. Please.
I am very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry to be the last talk before dinner. Hopefully you will survive. We'll do it quickly. This is a work we were doing. We started like six years ago, and it's going to be slightly different, highly connected to what we did before, but also very, very different. I want to start with the most important slide in the talk. This is the people that really did the work. I really want to mention first Ariel. Ariel is over in the audience, and he became a faculty in the Hebrew University, so now you have him in your house. Also, I want to mention Sam, Zaid, Bobby, and Ken, and Arsa, and Mia. And I want to mention people in NYU that we're collecting the data, the ECOG data that we're going to present. We have also a team in Google that I want to mention that's working with us, and collaboration, Ken and David, and the funding of the NIH, the Human Frontier. You cannot hear? I'm too tall for the microphone. We don't have like a... That's better? Yeah? Okay, let's do this. Then I can walk. Okay, so let's start. Well, no, there is like a replication crisis in our field in which we have like control experiment that we fail to replicate across labs. There is another problem. I won't call it crisis because I think we have enough crises in the world, especially in Israel. But this is the problem of basically ecological validity. And the problem is that many of our experiments that we have in the lab, even if we can replicate them across labs, they are failed to replicate to real life. And I think the reason for it, I'm going to summarize work that we did for many years, is that our lab experiment, we want them to be simple, ideal, interpretable, so we remove all the dimensions to make them very, very, very simple. And then we want it, because no one cares about Gabor pets, right? We want it basically to be generalized to other contexts. And the problem in real life, actually, they are multidimensional, they are really messy. You can call it confounded, cluttered, I will call it reality, okay? And then they also resist generalization. Whatever we learn in one context, not working in another context. And this is real life. So what I want to do in this talk and in my lab, basically, I want to understand what's happening now in my brain when I'm talking to you, and what's happening in your brain when you listen to me. But of course, this is too complicated. We have to wait 20 years to do it. And now I'm going to present to you a very simple experiment, but we decided not. Let's go and try to do it. So basically, we found a way to go to real life and stay in an experimental setup. There are ECOG patients that to implement their electrode beneath the scalp on the brain surface to monitor their epileptic track. And usually we come and do 20, 30 minutes experiment with them, but we decided let's not do an experiment. Let's record the entire week of data in the hospital, and then also have a microphone and a camera and record behavior. So now basically we have about 200 electrodes per patient, sampling 52 Hertz. So we have millions of brain data for a week. And during the week, let's say each day they are talking between 5 to 10 hours a day. And now we have a lot of speech data in real life. And we recorded 50 subjects, so I think we have the largest, really big data that will be also relevant for tomorrow's session about big data and speech and language. We're going only to present overall 4 subjects because the data is so big, we only managed to penetrate 4. But it's like 4 subjects give us about like 80 hours of speech and about 1 million words. So it's still big data. Example of the talk will be like, the nurse say, how is the food today? The patient say, yesterday it was way better, today the food is terrible. And the nurse say, sorry darling, can I bring you anything else? So this is like real life conversations. And I have to say, I did not think that we managed to model this real life experiment in real life, but that's what we're aiming for. Another thing I want to say, we have speech comprehension and speech production. While we know something about speech comprehension, we really know very, very little, whatever. We really know I'm going backward. We really know very little about speech production in the wild. Now I'm speaking to you for 45 minutes. I have no clue what I'm going to say till I'm saying it. Okay, so it's really something that we don't know a lot about it. We also have part of the subject listening to 30 minutes podcast from the NPR. And sometimes we have also subject. Can we close the light a bit? Because it's really, someone know how to close the light. We also have sometimes 2 patients bed to bed, so we can record 2 brains at the same time. That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, that's better, yeah. Okay. Still burning the slide. Oh. Okay. So how can we model this data? We record real life information, and usually we say, okay, we need a theory to model the data. If we go to our theories, basically, immediately we say, this is too complicated. Let's start with something more simple. So this is an example from Chomsky in which it took a sentence, remove all the semantic and the pragmatic, and stay with the syntactical structure. Once basically we look on this like a simple situation, we try to look on the phenomena, and we recognize part of language. For example, there is a structure, there are part of speech, there are like grammatical trees, maybe there are also underlying rules. And now we start to have a theory. Again, this theory, the problem, again, is not meant to work with real life. It's really designed to work in artificial setup, and it's not generalizing. I will give you an example. This is from Adele Goldberg from our department, linguistic. Take any linguistic rule that ever carried. It will have problem to generalize across context. Let me give you an example. Think about singular to plural, the most simple and trivial rule in English, right? Usually we say, add suffix s, you will go to the plural, right? But the problem is that you can say this is a very simple rule. The problem is that this will work only in some contexts, but not the other. For example, if you have the context of ending with x, now you need to add es. If you have the context of y, you have to drop the y, add is. You have the concept of ending with fe, we need to drop the f and fvs. Over here, this is a very irregular form. Please memorize. Over here, this is like a mass context, so the plural and the singular have the same form. And over here, this is even more strange. For example, now, pants have the plural form, but actually it's a singular form, or moose can be the plural form, but have the singular form. So you see, it's a very complicated structure across context, and if you will think about it in terms of rules, you can say, let's say for the common context, let's have a parabola. For this context, let's have sinus and cosinus. Over here, let's have linear relationship. Irregular context, let's basically have random walk. And over here, do nothing. You can see there is a function, but it's a very ugly function. This is the reality of real life. Each context, you have to apply some other rule. And remember, this is only basically, if you look on one context, you can say, oh, I have a very simple thing to model, but you always forget, and this is true for our experiment and for narrow context, that it's going to behave very differently in different contexts. Now, this is one dimension, and of course, there are so many structural dimensions, right? There are so many structural rules and syntactical rules. There's also so many semantic dimensions to language, and then there are also like so many pragmatical dimensions to language, so we say, we don't know how to model it, right? And again, it's all sitting in multidimensional manifold as we saw today. So now we need to go back to real life, because these theories are not working for us. And we have a problem in real life. So what we did so far, when I worked with natural stimulus for many years, we have like method to bypass it. For example, you can use one brain as a model to predict another brain. And it really helps us a lot, but it's not enough, right? Because for example, in our case, we have one brain, and I cannot use one brain to model itself, right? So we don't know how to go. Suddenly, really recently, 4 years ago, already maybe 5 years ago, in 2 weeks, a new language models came from artificial intelligence. And these language models are really interesting, and there are a family of them. They are interesting because they are trained on real-world data without relying on any psychological terms, and without trying to simplify the thing. You give them the reality, ask them to learn the context, and they start to learn language. So each one of you in the audience have a different feeling about deep learning. I'm not going to sample all of you, but I want to say 2 comments. First, I think we should stop calling them like black box, because they are fully transparent. We know everything about them. You can look inside each neuron, each synapse. You know the design of the circuit, you know the weights, you know the learning rules. We know everything. We know even their history. So basically, we can look inside and see how they are working. And I think that I want to say that this is a very simple thing relative to the brain. So if you cannot understand how this is working, while we know everything about it, there is no chance to understand the brain. So let's look a bit inside and see how it's working. Let's go back to our very